Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we dive into the fascinating world of compassion and how it transforms lives. Today, I'm incredibly excited to introduce our guest, David Prescott. David is a trailblazer in the realm of sex offender treatment, blending deep expertise with innovative approaches to make a real impact. David has authored several influential books, including Feedback-Informed Treatment, a guide to enhancing therapeutic outcomes. His work seamlessly integrates motivational interviewing with evidence-based practices to offer a compassionate and effective approach to treatment. His dedication to improving outcomes through client feedback with a focus on motivation is truly inspiring. From his contributions to the treatment of sexual offenders to his groundbreaking work in feedback-informed treatment, David's insights are not only profound but also practical. Today we'll explore his unique perspective on combining compassion with rigorous treatment techniques and how these can lead to meaningful change. Buckle up for an enlightening conversation with one of the foremost experts in the field. And so I bring you David Prescott. All right, well, uh, David Prescott, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
It's great to be here. It really is.
What are some of the established or core tenets, if you like, with respect to working with or treating perpetrators around sexual violence?
Sure. I'll try to do it as in condensed a fashion as I can, but it involves a little bit of history.
Yes, please.
And so way back in the 1960s or thereabouts, in one part of the U.S., there was a fellow who believed in kind of compassionate therapeutic approaches, much as you would find in any kind of psychotherapy. And by the way, if you notice my dogs in the background, please pay them no mind. They sometimes force an entry,
Yeah.
but they're having fun. And then in other parts of the world, there were these behavior therapists, students of Skinner and the like. And they said, aha, sexual offending must be tied to a sexual disorder or sexual deviance. So let's use our behavior therapy principles to reduce this target behavior. And they thought maybe if they used these principles, that then perhaps they would even be making innate changes to the sexuality of this person. Now, I'm choosing my words carefully because I think really in the old days, a lot of the practices were pretty close to conversion therapy.
Mm.
Over the years, many of us became actually quite pessimistic and thinking you really can't change somebody's innate sexuality. But in our case, we can help people to make changes to their behavior. In other words, and perhaps I hope not to be too off-putting with this, but I like ice cream. I can't eat it every day. So I don't change my like of ice cream, but I can change how I behave around ice cream. So that might be one way to think about it. And what then happened is that other people came along and said, well, let's try cognitive behavioral therapy. And then there were the third wave behavioral approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy that frankly in my field hasn't been explored all that well, although it certainly could be. And then within this, the part of the issue was that cognitive behavioral therapy really lends itself to being studied in a randomized controlled trial. So that's where you see a lot of the emphasis. So people said CBT is starting to produce some good results in alignment with some other kinds of principles known as the principles of effective rehabilitation for corrections, also known as the principles of risk and need and responsivity. So we know that giving lots of treatment to people who pose the highest risk seems to make the most amount of sense. And truly low risk individuals don't need a lot of treatment. And here comes our first shocker, which is not everybody is high risk. And in
Mm.
fact, the world is filled with people who say something to the effect of, "What have I done? I can't believe I hurt another human being. It all made sense at the time, but this really was a bad mistake on my part."
Mm.
So different levels of risk need different levels of different amounts of treatment. We need to focus treatment in areas that we know are associated with reoffending. Okay, that's not a surprise. And then there's this thing called responsivity, the responsivity principle, which holds that we need to use empirically supported methods and techniques and things like this. So that's all well and good, but they didn't really study this idea of compassion or intrinsic motivation to change. They didn't study the therapeutic alliance. And if you go and you ask these people about this, hey, how come you didn't study these aspects? They would say that as far as they were concerned, a good working alliance with a client is a given. That this should have been the foundation all along. They were trying to study all the other stuff. So you got to have compassion for these folks here. They
Mm.
were doing what they could with what they've got and within the limitations of science.
Mm.
So over time, and really, I need to mention the name of one fellow in particular, Bill Marshall in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's originally from Perth, Western Australia,
Oh.
moved to Canada, yes, and then did a lot of work down in New Zealand. So his truly international thinking here, he said, he started studying who are the most effective therapists in our field. And he found those therapists using cognitive behavioral therapy, all this other kind of stuff, but those therapists who are warm and empathic and rewarding and yet still directive in the sense of moving treatment forward, they got the best results. Harsh confrontational therapists could actually make matters worse. In the motivational interviewing research, we know that the level of empathy demonstrated by a clinician can make or break therapy. Bill Miller, I think, studied that at least 3 times. Terry Moyers and Bill wrote a paper asking, is low empathy toxic? This has then led me and others to say, so wait a minute, what do we really need? Now, meanwhile, I worked with all of these kids who had abused, and I've seen how harshly the world can treat kids who get into trouble. And it always struck me as really quite cruel. And it occurred to me, it made me reflect on my own upbringing. And, I've never abused anybody, I should probably say. And I never spent any time in juvenile justice. But I was a student in school. And it always, I can count the number of compassionate adults when I was growing up, on one hand.
Mm.
I know that's a terrible thing to say. There was this teacher, that teacher, but the rest really seemed to not be very compassionate. I'll just say that in order to keep it brief. So
Mm.
I think an entire sort of legacy of great minds has tried and tested a lot of things, many of which didn't work out, and a lot of the behavioral therapy approaches bore no fruit whatsoever. You can get people to sort of reduce their sexual interests, but you can't make them go away. And those same sexual interests seem to come back. So, with all due respect to the sensitivities of the people who may be watching this, I may make a very provocative statement and say, when somebody has a sexual interest in children, intrinsic sexual interest in children, I'm not optimistic we can make it go away. But I've met thousands of people with that interest who say, I don't ever want to hurt another kid, ever. Please give me the skills so that I don't do that. And many of them have then Google searched, how do I change my sexual interests? And they don't like what they see. And they need somebody that's going to be right there with them and deep and compassionate. And so I've come to think about this as what will help these individuals manage their behavior is is my understanding that we share a common humanity and my ability to express that and to understand how much we have the same goals in common. They want to be free. I want to be free. They want to be connected to people. I want to be connected to people. I can relate to people there. And that the source of so much of their connection, if they acted on it, could end up with them being in prison. If this isn't an invitation to compassion, I don't know what is. Am I making sense up to this point?
Oh, it's wonderful. The thing that occurs to me in a way is that even sort of back in the 60s, I guess, when they were starting to do those much more behavioral interventions and almost conversion type kind of approaches, as you were saying, it still came from a basic compassionate motivation by the sounds of it. I mean, the interesting thing is it was an effort to be helpful. Now, but it really speaks to the role of wisdom in compassion, I suppose, doesn't it? That compassion is about taking wise action to be able to reflect on our action and see, am I being helpful? And I suppose that's an iterative process. And over the decades, we've worked out that it's not just it's sort of the what and the how. There are certain skills or strategies that seem to be helpful, and there's an evidence base there, but there's this growing, or it's really a growing sense that it's also how you do it, the warmth, the empathy, the compassion, how that's expressed and conveyed is kind of what supercharges perhaps the actual skills or strategies.
Yeah. Imagine my delight to have an interviewer that gets it. I'm sort of more used to speaking with a member of the media or maybe somebody who's, interested in doing their PhD on this or whatever.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
you got it. Exactly. Thank you.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, have there been certain recent advances that have kind of really impressed you? I mean, what's the what if anything? But yeah, what's the latest on latest findings on some of this?
What a great question. I'll start from a somewhat cynical vantage point and say, I've done the work now for 40 years, and I remember in the 1980s when people came along and said serotonin, the three neurotransmitters. My goodness, we finally discovered it. Eureka, pay dirt, gold. And so the SSRIs were going to be the next greatest thing.
Yeah.
And that didn't come pan out quite as much as we thought. And then came the brain scans. And people said, it's all in the neurology. And just recently, there's in the media, there's been some talk about, hey, you know what? Maybe addiction isn't completely a brain disease after all. I'm like, what do you know? And then there's all the psychotherapy research from over at in Bruce Wampold's lab. And he comes along and says in the introduction of his 2015 book, he says, from what we can see, the most effective intervention is actually the most low tech, which is the human conversation. And so recently, I haven't seen a lot recently in our field. It seems as though the greatest advances are actually on the assessment side of things. But
Hmm.
you can develop a good measure, but does that really help with our wisdom and our deep understanding of a client? I guess for me, the most significant advances may have been in things like forensic compassion focused therapy. Those folks are doing some really, really good work. The problem is it's still formative. And I would say this to my friends' faces, and I consider myself one of their greatest proponents. But sometimes I think with some forms of compassion focused therapy, you have to have an IQ of about 170 to understand it all. So that would be sort of, one thing. So there, I think it's still kind of emerging and it's spoken in very high minded terms. So that seems to be it. I guess, what I'm thinking is the greatest advances are we have assessment measures that enable us so that I can walk into a room with a client and I can really have one ear trained for where are the risks and I can have one ear trained for how can I be there for this person in the moment?
Mm.
And we know enough about sort of professional boundaries that I can think to myself, I'm hearing a lot of risk at the same time as I'm hearing a lot of suffering. And I want to find a way to be helpful with the suffering
Mm.
at the same time as I'm going to be honest about the risk. And
Hmm.
what I found with clients is if I'm really straightforward in an ask, provide, ask framework, I'm telling them things that they've already concluded for themselves.
Mm.
I don't know if that. I hope that that helps. That's where I'm seeing it. But
Yeah.
there's all these fads out there along the way
Mm.
that that I sometimes wonder about. So
Yes, yeah. You definitely have that benefit of the sort of the bird's eye view across time, and certain things that come in and then, kind of sort of back away again. I know in a lot of psychology and psychotherapy, the psychedelics are the latest sort of thing, which I must admit I haven't
yes.
quite dived into very much yet, but I wonder whether that will be a similar thing.
Yeah, and I know there's one study that where the researchers said, well, we took the psychedelics, but then we removed the active ingredients to see will this still work? Will the mushroom work without the psychoactive effects? This kind of
Okay.
thing. And
Yeah.
then what I've written about has been abuse within the psychedelic therapy community because
Ah.
at least up until recently, they haven't had any. Their codes of ethics haven't been strong enough, and sometimes their supervisory processes haven't been strong enough. And what I do know is that somehow in the interactional component, perhaps with the drugs and with the right people and so on, and I know I'm not supposed to call them drugs. People get squeamish about that term, but let's call it what it is. There's still an interactive process and a relational process.
Yes.
And I promise I'll come back to task in a second, but all of it, what I keep coming back to, Stan, and I'm sure you've seen some of the same of this is, did you ever make any changes in your life because your therapist worked with an evidence-based manual? And
Yeah. Well,
did you ever change because of the great homework? Did you ever change because you challenged your own cognitive distortions? Little bits of this ring true, but I keep
yes.
coming back to that, at least in my field, and I bet in a lot of your practice too, people make changes. We're more experiential than we realize. And that people make changes because of a relationship experience
Mm.
in which hope and possibility are either born for the first time or reborn. And I
Mm.
suspect that that's going to be the magic ingredient in the psychedelic movement, and
Mm.
that the hope of the practitioner rubs off onto the client. Where I do get concerned is when people think, well, there's been some studies finding that some people who experience psychedelic psychotherapy end up taking more drugs, and I
No.
worry about where all of that leads. I
Mm.
don't know. Who knows? So many questions and yeah.
One
Anyway.
of one of the things you mentioned though, in terms of advances, and I think I'd like to sort of explore it a bit, is that notion of sort of being able to assess and engage with a sense of risk, but also stay engaged with the person's humanity and the suffering that's kind of there. And well, you've emphasized that notion of relationship and that sense of maintaining a compassionate motivation. You've worked with young people who perhaps are offenders or perpetrators, and in many ways, actually, speaking of CFT and Paul Gilbert, he sort of says, compassion is the courage to descend into the reality of the human experience, and it sort of, it seems that some of the work you do is really going to the coalface of just how tricky our brains can be as humans, and the urges and the desires that we really would rather not have, and yet there they are. They sort of, arise in our tricky brains and result in very difficult behaviors, sometimes behaviors that we might feel very challenged by, or even find abhorrent, or certainly, kind of in conflict with our own values and things like that. And yet we want to maintain that compassionate motivation. So what are some thoughts there, just in terms of kind of cultivating but also maintaining that compassionate motivation when working with some, especially some young people, but perpetrators?
Yeah, wow. I'm reminded of a defense attorney that I talked to at one point. He said, "I'm really trying to, give my client the best defense. What should I know about treatment?" I started describing what the treatment was about, and got into empathy and compassion. And he said, "Oh, I think I understand." He says, "My wife works in the emergency room and on Saturday nights, and people come in and they've been in terrible car accidents. And my wife taught me, I love this. My wife taught me that you don't give somebody less pain medication just because the accident was their fault."
Ah.
And I thought, wow, that's a really good point. That sometimes it's as though we withhold a little bit of empathy because we're angry at the client. And
Mm.
I hope I'm not getting too far off track of your question, but um, sometimes, horrible crimes evoke strong responses in us.
Mm.
And I've always sort of viewed my role as, look, it's time for me when I start hearing this stuff. What can I tell you, Stan? I've raised a couple of kids. I've been
Mm.
very concerned for their welfare and said, please don't let them get hurt or hurt others. I'm married. And so I want everybody to stay. This stuff evokes responses in me, but when I go to work, it's time to put on my psychological white lab coat. It's
Mm.
time for me to have, my best boundaries. And I think what happens is many people get a kind of flashbulb moment of the worst moments of this person's life.
Mm.
That moment when they committed a very serious crime. And if I could jump in too and just say something that most people don't know about people in my field is we are really committed to excellent care for survivors. That's a label, another label, people who've survived horrible things. Most of us have worked with people who've that can come at the expense of compassion for the person who's caused harm, because what we don't know in the flashbulb moment of this guy did that, because it's mostly been guys. Um, what we don't know is if we go back in their history, we often find upbringings that have been like a train wreck. So I've found in doing this work that good boundaries and understanding and developing a deep understanding of our clients' histories lend themselves easily to a more compassionate approach once we realize the complexity of human experience.
Mm.
And then when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at sexuality, I'm looking at decision making, I'm looking at possible attitudes and beliefs that made these kinds of behaviors possible. And if anything, working with kids has made me realize with adults, I'm looking at them, only they're kind of frozen in time. Uh, but I know what they were like when they were kids. Am
Mm.
I answering your question?
Yeah, that's wonderful. The importance of boundaries, that's something that really is a great
Yeah,
reminder, being able to sort of have those kind of boundaries. And it's funny with boundaries, isn't it? They're not necessarily just about having boundaries for the other person, but almost for ourselves, in a way that we feel kind of
right.
solid about our own boundaries, and what we're,
Yeah.
how we're trying to manage all of that. And then there's that idea of, this person was a child once too, for example, that they were born, and they were born with their particular brain and their particular genes and strengths and weaknesses, and then things just started to happen, and so much of what the version of who they became is not their fault, kind of thing, in a way. And I suppose that's the
Yeah,
really staying connected to that whole person, and
yeah,
the kind of the life that they've had, and being able to kind of empathize and sympathize with that while still maintaining a sort of appropriate attention to things like risk. And I mean, there's a lot going on there, isn't there, really? I mean, in
yeah.
being able to do this work, and it's impressive stuff.
And yeah, and an upbringing that might not have been their fault, but a future that is their responsibility.
Yes.
And
Yes.
oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the interesting kind of threading that needle. Sort of, it's not their fault. It's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. Yeah, that's very important. How do we de-shame? And because shame really is what's going to make them want to hide away, and perhaps just kind of circle back to their interest. Whereas, so we're wanting to de-shame, but not without regard to trying to sort of manage behaviors, I suppose.
yeah, yeah, a lot to it.
Mm,
Human beings, boy, and
yeah.
you just gotta have compassion for yourself doing any kind of therapeutic work, I guess.
That's true. Yeah. Do,
Yeah.
do you find that the community at large is able to kind of come along with some of that? Is there a lot of pushback there? What do you notice from that
Such
compassion?
a great question.
Yeah.
So let me introduce you to a friend of mine
Mm.
who said in a YouTube video that she thought would only be viewed by her maybe 10 to 12 friends.
Yeah.
This is what she said. And she said, there's a real trend when working with people. There are all these people. First of all, here's a scary statistic. Some studies have found that up to as many as 8 or 9% of adult males, have said that they would sexually abuse a child if they knew that there was no harm done and that they wouldn't get caught and all of this kind of stuff. So huge number. I mean,
Mm,
now the amount of people that actually act on that interest much smaller, but there's a lot of people out there who are troubled by their sexual interests and they want help. And they say, the term pedophile has become so pejorative that, we don't want to be called that, but we fully acknowledge that we are minor attracted. We are attracted to minors. We're attracted to kids. Call us minor attracted people, by the acronym MAP. I have my own discomfort with this terminology myself, but it's for another day, I suppose. But they say call us. So this woman said in a video, um, I call my clients minor attracted people. The next thing you know, she got investigated in her workplace, basically was invited to leave, and there was a tweet storm. It's now X, of course, but back in those days, Twitter. 72,000 negative tweets. 72,000. I
wow.
once interviewed her to say, how did you survive? How is it that you keep doing this work? Where did you find your strengths and your resilience and everything else? But I saw some of those tweets, and they were not for the faint of heart. I
Mm,
mean, death threats, the whole bit. So much of it is in how you frame the issues.
mm,
And so she said this thinking she was speaking to her friends. Now, when I talk to somebody on an airplane and they invariably ask me what I do, I explain first that I'm in the field of child sexual abuse prevention. I'm actually in the field of trying to prevent all forms of sexual abuse. There is a lot of misogyny out there. And there's a lot of violence out there. My little corner of the world is sexual abuse prevention.
mm,
And I find people say, good for you. Thank you for doing the work that you do. But I think to myself, I'm not that different from my friend who, even two famous politicians. One I know was a United States senator, and I forget who the other one was, maybe a governor, retweeted this hatred and all of this.
Ah.
How we frame things makes such a difference. Here in the US, even right now, there are some advertisements that you might see on YouTube that say, your trauma is real, your pain is real, and we can help. And it's an advertisement for therapy. And so, with other people then coming along and saying, I'm so sick of hearing about trauma, these people just need to pull their socks up and get on with life and stuff like
Mm.
this. So how we frame the issues, but the one thing is we're all seeking to prevent sexual abuse. That's the
Mm.
common ground. As the late great musician Frank Zappa once said, the most important part of art is the frame. And so I would say
Mm.
that's the same thing with our messaging. So I'm sorry if I've gone on too long about this, but
Yeah, no,
it's really, yeah.
it's yeah, that's
And the public joins up with us. That's what I'm trying to say. Everybody wants to prevent sexual abuse.
yes, yeah, gotcha, yeah. Yeah, so YouTube or Twitter or those sort of, I mean, they're pretty difficult places these days, aren't they? And there's a lot of the ad hominem attack sort of thing, people attacking the person, and
Mm,
so on. But the frame is key, and really that's what compassion is too, isn't it? Is alleviating and preventing suffering. And so, that's
yes.
where you're really coming from.
Yeah. And against a backdrop of these days, we tend to be very polarized. I'm not sure about
Mm.
Australia, but certainly
Oh, yeah.
around here, there was an ethic of in this world, there are oppressors and the oppressed. And I stand firmly in the corner of the oppressed. And I've often thought to myself, that's maybe not the most helpful way to think about it. And I've certainly known any number of men who are, you could even say, victims of their own oppression or of the hegemonic masculinity that we see
Mm.
in so many places, et cetera. So without getting into the weeds on it, I guess what I'm saying is experience is so complicated and how we think about these things. But yeah, all human beings, I think, want to alleviate suffering, and it's amazing to me how compassionate we become when we actually understand a little bit about what somebody's done
Mm.
and who that person is. We
Mm.
tend to be a lot more compassionate towards politicians, for example, who we know. If
Ah, yes.
maybe that's a little bit of a dangerous statement, but yeah,
I think that's the case with everything, isn't it? The more we know about the person, the more we're able to empathize and be compassionate. Was it Abraham Lincoln that said, "I don't like that man very much. I must get to know him better," or something like that? I don't know if that's a
that that does sound yeah, yeah, yeah.
something
It's
like that.
great.
It
Yeah.
sounds a little bit like um, the way you are able to work with perpetrators and those who've perhaps the survivors as well, that to be able to have sort of some attention in both directions actually helps to support the sort of the compassionate motivation in a way. Would that be something?
Can you say that again? I want to make sure I answer it.
I,
Yeah.
I noticed you said that many practitioners will work with perpetrators and survivors, I think, and I
Yes.
wondered
Yes.
whether, because I've always felt like that sounds hard, it's quite a sort of a shift in kind of focus, or and also a shift in kind of heart space or something. I'm not sure quite how to say that, but I almost get the impression that to work in those two directions can kind of help support both or something.
Yes. It tears some people apart,
No.
going back and forth across an equation. And other people seem to thrive in it. And
Okay.
one thing I've always loved about the people in my field is for so many of them, this is truly a calling. It is a
Mm.
calling, and the idea of not being able to do this work can be quite upsetting to them. But I guess, in the end, I always come back to so much of what I do. as a human being and as a clinician, compassion, so much of compassion is a skill that you can learn, that you can practice. And I think that you can get better at. The sort of classic Pablo Casals when he was 90. Everybody knows he used to practice 8 hours a day. And when asked why, he said, because I think I'm beginning to get it.
Yeah.
I'm like, dude, you're Pablo Casals, you're 90. But the older I get, the more I agree with that.
Yes, it's all a
You
practice,
know?
isn't it? Um,
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
you mentioned motivational interviewing, so how have you come to integrate that into your work?
Yeah, well, I'm the sort of classic person who hears about it and says, ah, that's been in my heart all along. I think I've been doing that. And then you find out that you haven't been doing it. But it was 2002, MI2 had just come out, and I said, yeah, that's it. Why am I? And I actually said, I've been trying to write down what I do. These people already did. They already wrote it down. So,
Yeah.
being the inherently lazy person that I am, maybe I can just sort of get their book. And I read the book and I said, yeah, this is it. And then I saw some of the initial videos that came out, and here's Bill and Steve saying, oh, we learned it from our clients. And I said, right on, testify. Yeah, all of this kind of stuff. And then I did some training with Steve Berg-Smith. I mean, I really want to sort of honor my ancestors here. Steve
Mm.
Berg-Smith, one of the greatest people on the planet, and then realized, wow, this is more difficult than I thought. Like, this is much more difficult than I thought. And now here I am all these years later. And Stan, I just recorded myself doing MI this morning,
Mm.
hoping to get some coding. And I'm like, oh no, she went straight to change talk and I didn't elicit it. How is this going to look in my, mighty coding and stuff like this? And part of me said, okay, it was a really good interview. I'm really happy with it, but I didn't get to do, everything and blah, blah, blah. So I guess, I kept thinking, the kids that I work with need this.
Mm.
And they're not my kids, and I shouldn't use a possessive pronoun, but people could really use MI. And now that you're asking the question, I have to go to, I don't know if you were at the MI, the Mint Forum in 2015, I think it was, 15 in Montreal.
Mm. No.
And anyway, at one point, Bill asked a question, how has practicing MI changed you? And I thought, wow, what a question that is. So I learned it, and I wanted to be the most helpful that I could be with my clients who I wasn't always perfect with. I wanted to get better, but then gradually somehow got changed into MI as a kind of, yeah, this is the beginning. Uh, I want to do MI all the time, and that there's so much more to human experience too, that it's almost sort of MI as a kind of anchor point for in that moment when I don't know what I'm doing with a client. I'm just empathy, reflect, compassion, empathy, reflect, compassion. Is this making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I
As
mean,
a,
I think that's how I feel about it as well. In some ways, motivational interviewing really helps to operationalize a little bit, the kind of compassionate action, listening well
yeah,
and yeah.
thank you. That's yeah, what I'm trying to say.
The thing that I've always really loved about you and knowing you and so on is how we've had all these little touch points just sort of randomly, and the other one of course is the feedback informed treatment, where
Yeah,
I think that was actually where we first met back in 2011, and we were at the sort of some Scott Miller training in Chicago, I think it was, and really that's you've kind of alluded to that already today, just that idea of kind of getting feedback and trying to, kind of measure outcomes, I guess, in a sense. You've written sort of the book, I think, with Scott and Cynthia, Feedback Informed Treatment in Clinical Practice, Reaching for Excellence. So how do you use, formal fit approaches in your work?
Yeah, well, these days I supervise clinicians that use it. Uh,
Hmm.
and excuse me, um, I knew you would ask this, and I got to reflecting on it and thinking more again that sort of fit operationalizes a way of being and a way of working with people, including the deliberate practice piece. I was so happy when MI practitioners started talking about deliberate practice. And so the way that I used it is pretty much you can read the articles, and I start with just checking in on overall well-being. I am a big fan of the outcome rating scale, but more important to me is tracking how is this client doing? Are they getting better, or am I seeing better than worse, which is a lot of my clients, frankly, and that tells me that they are not in, they don't experience themselves as in control of their lives as they would like. So I use the measures as a kind of GPS. Where are we going, and where, or maybe GPS in reverse. Where have we been?
Mm.
And then use the session rating scale at the end to try to get a bead on how am I doing with my working alliance. And some of the best feedback I've ever gotten I, has been around use of motivational interviewing, where the all-time winner of my awesome feedback award was a kid that said after session one, if you and I are going to work together, man, you got to ask me more questions. And I said, you got to tell me more. You got to tell me more. And he said, well, you see, I'm going to lie to you. I'm just going to lie to you. And so you got to hold my feet to the fire by asking me the tough questions. And I had been thinking at my time, why didn't I get to record this session to get my, some
Mighty.
mighty coding or whatever? Because this was like world class MI. I just did it, boy, and all of this. And he's telling me it wasn't good. And I
Yeah.
had to brood on the feedback for a long time. So the question then became, how do I become more pointed without losing my alliance and without losing the style and spirit of motivational interviewing? So I did. I used a lot more ask, provide, ask, and I asked some more direct questions. And gradually over time, I found he was honest with me, and that I could just get back to some good old reflective listening.
Mm.
So I might use it in an active way like that and use the measures. But honestly, now having done it for so long, the most useful feedback that I get is the superficial feedback, because that's telling me I'm not there yet and that the
Mm.
client isn't fully engaged. And I've just become such a fan of, I want to know what is the low hanging fruit? What is the sort of feedback that's right here in my environment that I'm not, that other people might not see because they don't know to look for it. And so that slight lack of enthusiasm at the end of the session, oh no, it's all great as they look at the door. What am I missing? And so with these people, I sort of always think of my friend Wendy in the UK, who you've probably heard about from Scott, sort of a mutual friend, who
Mm.
says, you know, you got to tell me. If I don't, I really need your feedback
Mm.
to really do my job correctly. And I saw a video like that, and I said, I can't believe her. She's really, as Scott Miller jokes about her, you can't leave until you've beaten me up just a little bit, he says. But the classic Scott Miller humor.
Yeah.
But I asked her, and she said, I don't deserve the reputation that I have, David. This is really important. She said, I don't deserve the reputation that I have. She said, David, honestly, if I don't ask for feedback, I will be wrong more often than I'm right.
Mm.
And I thought, Now we're really somewhere. And then recently, this might sound off topic, it's not. I watched an interview. I was bored on the treadmill. I go to YouTube and I look up Grateful Dead, one of my bands that I grew up with. It makes me, it's like an American, yeah, okay. So old American boy thing. And I found an interview with Jerry Garcia, their guitar player, their famous guitar player. And
Mm.
he said in this interview, I have to practice more than other guitar players because otherwise I won't be at my best. I'm not like these other people. I need to practice. And I thought, he's like Wendy. This is
Mm.
it. And it goes to what researcher, a psychotherapy researcher in Norway, her name is Helena Nielsen Lee, and she titled an article on research, her research summary was Love Yourself as a Person, Doubt Yourself as a Therapist. So I find there's the measures, there's they do it at the end of the session, get your feedback from the client, but then what are all the little ways that you're not getting it?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's really that's what I love more than anything else.
Yeah, that's
So
amazing. Having to sort of it's tuning in, isn't it, to the subtleties of feedback too. Like there's the
yeah,
more blatant elements to it, and administering the SRS and having the inquiry, and that's all very important stuff too. But as well as that, sort of tuning into the subtleties. You've given me a little revelation, actually, David, but from my own self. So I really appreciate this. I've sort of worked out that in a way, for me, compassion is the sort of the intention, the commitment to be helpful. Motivational interviewing is my way to be helpful, and fit is my way to check to see whether I am being helpful. And that little three-step flow, I think, kind of, yeah, I'm going to ponder that a little bit more.
that's fantastic. Now, in my field, there's this idea of primary prevention, which is when you just stop abuse from happening to begin with. Then there's secondary when you stop abuse from happening amongst those that are most at risk. And then there's tertiary prevention, which is people like me who try to prevent further offending after it happened. But then there's also quaternary prevention, which is making sure that our other forms of prevention don't actually cause harm.
Hmm.
And yeah, and so I'm thinking sort of that's my variation of what you just said.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
and it's something, in the with juveniles, they used to put kids into boot camps and take them out into some southwestern desert and make them do calisthenics. And then, programs get shut down because they forgot to give the kids ample water and stuff like this. And it's like, the calisthenics were, this was never going to work. And then you get other kinds of approaches that
Hmm.
also have scared straight that didn't work and could make people worse, all based on good ideas, but
Hmm.
didn't pan out. So how do we then get feedback from people? If I may, just one of my other stars to steer by was when I worked in a big institution as a clinical director. And the people who worked for me wanted to give feedback to to a clinician. And they did so in a way that made me recoil, but I didn't want to sell them out. I didn't want to betray them. And it was a difficult situation, but I will never, ever forget the clinician who's listening to their feedback and who then said, if you're wondering if this is helpful, I want to assure you that it's not. And I will never forget those words.
Hmm.
Um, you know, you could have been
Hmm.
helpful, but instead you've been so much more. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
little
No,
bit of
that's
humor from Bill
no,
Murray.
but that's
But
that's very well, powerful moment,
yeah,
and that clinician
yeah,
found the sort of the strength and wherewithal to kind of express, I guess, assertively and very effectively. Because compassion, yeah, it's sort of it's may I be helpful rather than harmful. towards
Yeah.
myself and others. And so
Yeah.
we're absolutely trying to keep one eye on just sort of, at the very least, not being harmful.
Yeah. And Stephen Andrew often talks
Mm,
about having his anchor point of, I am here for you, dear one.
mm, mm,
And I really like that.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
he says it with just the right boundaries with men who've been violent and
mm,
things like this. But it's his kind of way of, may I be of service to you? And I am here for you, dear one.
mm.
I just couldn't respect that guy anymore if I tried.
The thing that it makes me think about too is offering that same kind of promise to oneself, I guess. I'm here for you, dear one, in that self-compassionate sort of way as well. How do you what do you do there? Are there little tricks or little practices or things that you do to kind of, well, to sort of maintain your compassion and so on, but also from that self-care point of view, that
Yeah.
self-compassion point of view?
Well, thanks for asking. Number one, I was recently interviewed and somebody said, so what do you do for fun? And I didn't have a good answer. And I thought to myself, I don't really have fun, but I do a lot of things that bring me joy.
Okay.
And I guess maybe that's, and so I recently also just published a sort of survey, informal survey on this. And I found that most of us actually do things in we tend to have the same activities. Stan, I spend as much time out in nature as I can.
Yeah.
And it may seem weird, but I, sort of do my own, I meditate a lot. And I also do certain kinds of meditations of, maybe it could be as simple, and I love the stuff over your right shoulder, inhale,
Yes.
exhale. It could also be, who knows what the active ingredient is, but I might inhale white light and then exhale any unwanted energies into the ground.
Mm,
I might inhale love and then exhale love back out into the universe.
mm,
A little trick that I got from yoga, is sort of, inhale love, exhale peace. But I find it works for me.
mm,
Sometimes called the yoga mantra. And there's a guy in Bucharest, Romania, who's a fit practitioner, and you might know, named Bogdan Yon.
mm,
And he told me he was the one when I said I inhale love, but then what do I want to exhale it back out? But does that mean that and he said, yeah, actually, I've struggled with this. And he said, my answer is inhale love, exhale love out to the eternal love. I
mm,
thought, okay, now we're getting someplace. I love this. So what I've found is the older I get, the more I really need that kind of stuff.
mm,
And
mm.
so my hobbies, my joy, and my self-care all kind of boil down to meditation and spending time in nature. And as you might have seen evidence, I have a couple of dogs and I walk them
Yes.
too, and
Yeah.
lots of fun. So
And
that's what I
perhaps
do, and time with family. Sorry.
perhaps a little bit of Grateful Dead and Frank Zappa as well,
Yeah,
sounds like.
yeah. Every now and then, when I've thrown, okay, look, enough of that. I need something, something even, just something really simple. Yeah, Grateful Dead
Yeah.
and Frank Zappa would certainly do it.
Yeah.
And you know what else is? I think Ringo Starr in 1967 got it. I get by with a little help from my friends. He once
Mm.
sang with the Beatles. And so interacting with people like you really does
Yes.
bring me joy.
Yes.
I just froze. Oh, did we just? I thought I lost you for a second.
I think we froze briefly, but
Okay,
but
you
yes,
got the idea.
interacting with friends and colleagues around the world. I mean, that's really the motivation behind this whole channel, to be honest, is a chance to sort of get to talk to people, and it's
Yes.
part of my self-care as well. Just
Yeah.
one thing on Ringo. Apparently, he was a very naughty practicer. He didn't practice nearly as much as he should have, apparently.
I've heard that. But on the other hand, when he went out on his own, he always surrounded himself with people that were arguably better musicians than he was.
Yeah.
So John Lennon once said, Ringo's not even the best drummer in the Beatles.
Yes.
And we all surround ourselves. If I could, I'm sorry, if it doesn't take too much. Daryl Chow, who's a fit expert as well, works with Scott Miller, also uses the term genius. He said it's not just about being a genius, but it's also being part of the right scene. And so
Oh,
put scene and genius together, you have genius. And I really like that idea. I think he got that word from musician Brian Eno. But yeah, so when you're together with your fellow Mint practitioners in Christchurch, for the conference, my guess is you will all be better for each other's presence. I wish I could
yeah.
be there. And when you came to Chicago that time, and by the way, you brought me a T-shirt because I'd asked for an Australia T-shirt. So when we're talking compassion in a T-shirt, I'm like, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, all of those kinds of things. We're all
Yeah.
stronger and better together. Yeah.
Yeah, the sort of the connectedness, the belonging, the sense of being a part of things, and it's all helps with the soothing affiliative system, and kind of feeling safe and secure, and then kind of able to kind of explore the world, I guess, from there. That's the thing.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, yes, thank you very much. I've gotten a lot out of all of that. I think there's so much there to reflect on. Really appreciate the work you do and the enthusiasm that you bring to it. And of course, Safer Societies is maybe just mention
Yes.
Safer Societies if you wouldn't mind before we finish up.
Our mission is to harness the power of compassion and innovation to create a world free from sexual abuse and social violence. It's a mission we take very seriously, and I work closely with my colleagues there, including Sarah Snow Haskell, our Director of Operations. We've been around since 1982. We do free webinars as well as online trainings, sometimes for CEs, sometimes not. We publish workbooks and professional books. So if you Google search David Prescott Safer Society, you can find out more. Really encourage you, like, come on along. We try to, you see my dog's tail in the background. We try to produce as much of a sense of community as we possibly can.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, I'll definitely have those links in the show notes, so to speak. So yes, David Prescott, thank you very much for speaking with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
And thank you for having me, Stan. It's just so much fun. Thank you.